A widow stood at the edge of everything she had ever known and watched it be taken from her. The morning held no color, not the soft gray of early winter, but something harder, something that had already decided, the kind of cold that does not ask permission. It simply arrives, settles into the bones, and stays. Nora Vance stood on the frozen ground outside the only home she had known since her marriage, and she did not cry. Not because she was not afraid. She was terrified. But her son was watching, and Eli always watched her face before he decided how to feel about something. So she kept her face still, the way her father had taught her to read the ground, quietly, without flinching, even when what you found was difficult. Behind her, the door of the house closed with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The men from the council had already turned away. They had said what they came to say, read what they came to read, and now they were done with her. Aldrich Holt stood near the road, his coat too fine for the cold, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction that comes not from winning something, but from removing something. He looked at her the way a man looks at furniture being carried out of a room. "She has nothing," he said to no one in particular, "because she is nothing." He did not shout it. He did not need to. The words carried easily in the frozen air, past the neighbors standing behind curtains, past the woman from the boarding house who had already shaken her head when Nora's eyes found hers, past the reverend who studied the sky as if it held something more interesting than accountability. Eli pressed close to her side. He was 9 years old and small for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his grandfather's habit of going very quiet when he was thinking hard. Against his leg, Soot, a black dog of uncertain origin and absolute loyalty, found shivering near the refuse pile 3 weeks prior, pressed equally close, as if the three of them could form something solid enough to matter. Nora picked up the bundle at her feet. Everything she owned, everything that remained. It was not heavy. That was perhaps the cruelest part. How little a life weighed when reduced to what could be carried. She did not look at the house again. She did not look at Aldrich Holt again. She turned north. Eli fell into step beside her without being asked. Soot followed without being called. That was enough. That had to be enough. The North Rise was not a destination most people considered. It sat at the edge of the useful world, where the timber thinned and the ground changed character. Harder, older, full of old intentions. A mining operation had been attempted there years before Nora was born, by men who believed the rock held something worth reaching. It had not. The enterprise had failed. The men had moved on, and the land had quietly reclaimed what little had been disturbed. Nora's father had worked that ground, not as an owner, as a man who understood it. William Vance had been a miner's miner, a Cornwall man's son who carried old knowledge in his hands the way other men carried tools. He had spoken of that ground with a kind of respect that Nora had absorbed without understanding, the way children absorb things that matter before they know why. She had not been back since she was small, but she remembered the way. The entrance to the old works lay half-buried, choked with brush and years of indifference. The timber framing at the opening had softened but not collapsed. The stone alongside it held the way stone holds, without drama, without complaint, simply present. Eli stood at the edge and looked down into the dark. "Can we really live here, Mama?" Nora looked at the ground, at the rock, at the depth of the cold air above them, and the stillness of the earth below. "Your grandfather taught me everything the ground can hold," she said, "and the ground never lies." Eli considered this with the seriousness of a child who has learned that his mother's statements are worth considering carefully. Then he nodded once, the way his grandfather used to nod, a gesture that meant, "I don't fully understand yet, but I trust the direction." They went in. The air changed immediately. Not warm, not yet, but different. Still. The brutal insistence of the wind above simply stopped. Nora stood in the opening and let herself feel that stillness for a moment, the way a person pauses at the threshold of something important before stepping fully through. The silence underground was a different quality of silence than the silence above. Above ground, silence was the absence of sound. Temporary, conditional, something the wind could end at any moment. Below ground, silence was structural. It was built into the stone, into the mass of earth above, into the particular physics of a place that had been sealed from the moving world for long enough that stillness had become its natural condition. It was the silence of something that had decided. Nora had grown up hearing her father describe it. He had tried many times to explain what it felt like, working underground. The quality of the quiet, the sense of the weight above, the particular intimacy of a space where the world had been pushed back to a specific distance and held there. She had listened and nodded and never quite understood. The way children listen and nod and store things they can't yet use. She understood it now. She set the bundle down. She lit the small lantern from her coat pocket. The flame held, small, specific, and entirely real. Everything she had, and everything she needed to begin with. A beginning that asked nothing except that she not stop. The space was low but not cramped, wide enough to matter, with stone walls that had been cut and then abandoned and had spent years simply existing. There was a natural slope to the ground that she recognized immediately, the way her father had described it long ago, speaking of useful things as if facts were gifts worth giving carefully. And then she saw it, near the wall, half buried under a fall of loose earth and old timber, a tin box. Small, rectangular, the kind made to hold documents or keepsakes against damp and time. Rust had moved across the surface in uneven patterns, but the box itself held its shape, held its lock. On the lid, scratched into the metal with something sharp, a nail perhaps, or a belt buckle, 2 letters, and a phrase. W-Phi, he knew. He stayed. Nora's hands went still. She knew those initials. She had written them herself, as a child, on the cover of the only book her father had given her. William Vance. Her father. The man who had disappeared from her life when she was 6 years old, leaving behind a silence that no one in the family had ever fully explained. Gone, they said. Just gone. She reached for the box the lock held. Whatever was inside, whatever her father had left in this ground, in this specific darkness, as if he had known someday someone with his blood would come looking. It was not yet ready to give itself up, but it was there. Eli had found a flat piece of stone near the rear wall and was sitting on it, watching her, soot pressed against his knee. "What is it, Mama?" Nora set the box carefully against the wall where she could see it, where she would not forget it. "Something your grandfather left behind," she said. "We'll open it when we have light enough to read by." She stood. She looked at the space around her, the stone, the depth, the stillness, the box against the wall with its scratched letters and its locked silence. and she made the decision that people make when they have no choices left and discover that having no choices is, in a strange way, a kind of freedom. This was their home now, not because it was what she wanted, because it was what remained. And sometimes what remains, if you understand it, if you respect it, if you build with it rather than against it, sometimes what remains is exactly enough. Outside, the cold continued its work. The town of Gray Hollow went about its business, curtains drawn, opinions settled, the verdict on Nora Vance already written and filed. None of them knew about the box. None of them knew what was coming. And none of them, not Aldrich Holt, not the Reverend, not the neighbors who had looked away, understood yet what it meant that a woman who knew the ground had chosen to go beneath it. They would. The first thing Nora built was fire, not shelter, not walls, not the careful, engineered system she would eventually construct from stone and patience and her father's remembered voice. Just fire, a small, necessary flame in the dark, because without it, nothing else was possible. The last 3 matches were in her coat pocket. She had counted them twice on the walk north, the way a person counts what little they have left, not to feel poor, but to feel precise. Precision was something she could control. Fear was not. She arranged the kindling the way William Vance had shown her years ago, on a cold morning that had smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, and the particular patience of a man who believed that how you did small things revealed how you would do large ones. Dry material at the center, progressively larger pieces outward, a small cone of intention. She struck the first match. The wind that found its way through the entrance killed it before it caught. She waited. She adjusted the arrangement, used her body to block the draft, and struck the second match. It held for 3 seconds, then guttered, then died. 1 match left. Eli was watching her from the flat stone, soot pressed against his side, both of them very still in the way that children and dogs go still when they understand that something important is happening, and the most useful thing they can offer is their silence. Nora sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. She was not praying. She was remembering. Her father's hands, broad and calloused, demonstrating something she had not fully understood at 6 years old, but had stored somewhere deeper than understanding. The way he had cupped his palms around a piece of flint and a small steel striker, moving with a rhythm that was almost musical. The spark needs a place to land, he had told her. You have to give it something to want. She opened her eyes, looked around the dim space. Near the back wall, where a seam in the stone had shed flakes over years of freeze and thaw, she found what she needed. A thin curl of dry moss, protected from moisture by the overhang above it, fragile as paper, as old as patience. She placed it at the center of the kindling. She positioned herself over it completely, arms forming a windbreak, body curved low over the one thing that mattered. She struck the last match. The moss caught. The flame moved from moss to kindling to larger wood with the steady, unhurried logic of something that had been waiting for permission. Within minutes, it was real. Within the hour, the chill in the chamber had shifted from brutal to merely present. The difference between cold that hunts you and cold that simply exists alongside you. Eli exhaled. It was the longest breath she had ever heard from a child. There, Nora said. Not triumphant. Factual. She had one resource left in her reserves. Everything her father had taught her. The fourth night was the worst. By then, the fire was established. The entrance partially blocked with a section of old timber Nora had dragged from the collapsed framing outside, and 2 bedrolls arranged near the heat. The basic architecture of survival was in place. But survival and living are different things, and Eli was sick. It had started as a chill his small body could not shake, progressing through the afternoon into a fever that climbed steadily, quickly, without negotiation, with a thoroughness that frightens adults who have learned that the body's certainties are not always benign. He had stopped eating on the 3rd day. Nora had stopped eating on the 1st, though she had not told him this. When he asked if she had taken her portion, she said yes. She said it the way her mother had said certain things, quietly, without decoration, as if the words were built to hold weight rather than to mislead. She sat beside him through the 4th night with his head in her lap and his breathing too shallow and her hands moving in small, steady circles on his back, because that was all she had. The stored food was rationed to last as long as possible. The water she had collected from a seepage point deep in the passage was clean but cold. She warmed it in the tin cup and made him drink when he was lucid enough to swallow. Soot did not move from Eli's side. The dog had understood something from the beginning, that this child was the center of this small world, and that guarding the center was his purpose. He lay pressed against Eli's back, and the warmth he offered was not symbolic. It was physical, practical, real. Around midnight, Eli's temperature reached its peak. Nora had her father's voice for company. "The body knows how to fight," William Vance had said once, when Nora herself had been sick and frightened. "Your job is to give it something to fight toward." She gave Eli water. She gave him warmth. She gave him her voice, low and steady in the dark, telling him stories about his grandfather, a man Eli had never met, a man who had walked this same ground and understood it in ways that were still, even now, revealing themselves. Before dawn, the fever broke. It did not announce itself. It simply receded, gradually, then completely, leaving behind a child who was pale and tired and entirely, miraculously present. Eli opened his eyes. "I'm hungry," he said. Nora pressed her face against his hair and did not speak for a long moment. "Good," she finally managed. The work began in earnest after that, because it had to. Nora understood the physics of the space with the inherited instinct of a woman who had grown up hearing a man describe the earth not as an obstacle, but as a collaborator. Her father had spoken of underground spaces the way architects speak of buildings, as conversations between intention and material, between what you want and what the ground is willing to offer. The chamber was roughly 12 feet wide at its broadest point and perhaps 20 feet deep, with a ceiling that varied between 6 and 8 feet. The entrance passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, useful because cold air, being heavier, would settle toward the entrance while warmer air accumulated in the deeper chamber. This was not luck. This was geology, and Nora knew how to use it. She widened the entrance first, just enough to allow easier movement of materials, then reinforced the framing with timber salvaged from the collapsed structure above. She built the frame not for aesthetics, but for load distribution, every joint carrying weight to its neighbor, no single point bearing more than its share. The floor she cleared completely, removing years of accumulated debris until she reached solid stone. Then she laid a bed of dry material gathered from the surrounding hillside, packed moss, dry earth, flattened brush, as a barrier between the cold ground and the living space above it. Eli appeared at the entrance while she was still working on the floor, carrying a flat stone in both arms with the slightly exaggerated effort of a child who wants to be taken seriously as a laborer. "It's starting to look like something," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done. He was right. It was. He set the stone down carefully and studied the space with an engineer's eye. Or rather, with the eye of a child who has inherited an engineer's instinct without yet having the vocabulary to name it. He walked the perimeter, ran his hand along the wall where the stone changed texture, crouched and pressed his palm against the floor material she had laid. "It's warmer than outside," he said. "That's the point. But we haven't built the stove yet. We don't need one yet. The earth holds what warmth we make. Your great-grandfather called it the patience of the ground. It remembers heat longer than anything above it." Eli considered this. He had the habit, inherited from both the men in his lineage, of testing an idea from several angles before accepting it. "So the ground is like a storage jar," he said finally. "Exactly like a storage jar." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to carrying stones. But she noticed over the following days that he paid different attention to the ground after that, pressing his feet flat when he walked, occasionally crouching to lay his palm against the earth as if checking on it. She built the fire chamber against the deepest wall where the stone was thickest and would hold heat longest. Not an open fire, contained, stone-lined with a narrow flue she angled carefully, because smoke must leave but heat must stay, and the difference between a flue that works and one that does not is a matter of a few degrees of angle and the patience to get it right. The first draft failed. She had expected it. She rebuilt the flue at a slightly steeper angle, tested it again, watched the smoke rise correctly, felt the chamber begin, slowly, surely, to warm. "There it is," she heard her father say. Not memory exactly. Something closer to presence. It took 11 days to make the space functional, not comfortable. Functional was a different thing, a more important thing. The difference between surviving the season and not. Throughout those 11 days, Grey Hollow watched. They came in ones and twos, out of curiosity more than cruelty, though the line between those things in a small town is thinner than people like to admit. Silas Webb arrived on the 4th day. He was a heavy-set man with a general store, a gift for remembering debts, and a talent for reducing complicated situations to simple judgments. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his thumbs in his belt and looked down at Nora, who was on her knees, reinforcing a section of the side wall. "Building yourself a grave?" he asked. Nora did not look up. "Building myself a home." He laughed, not viciously, just the comfortable laugh of a man whose own position feels secure enough to find others' effort amusing. He was back 2 days later with 3 other men, and this time he had brought a hand-painted sign, which he drove into the frozen ground at the edge of the path. "Nora's Folly," it read. The men laughed. One made a comment about moles. Another suggested that a woman of her age and situation ought to be looking for charity rather than creating curiosities. Eli, who had been carrying stones from the hillside when they arrived, set down his load and looked at the sign for a long moment. Then he picked up his stones again and went back to work without saying anything. That night, Nora sat beside the fire and watched him by its light. Her son, 9 years old, carrying stones without complaint, without self-pity, without the performance of suffering that adults sometimes indulge in to make their hardship visible. He simply worked. She thought, "Whatever I am building here, I am also building him." Reverend Stokes came on the 7th day. He was a tall man with a considered manner and the particular authority of someone accustomed to being the final word on difficult questions. He stood at the entrance to the passage and spoke in measured tones. "Pride is a poor foundation," he said. "The community has resources for those in genuine need. There is no shame in accepting them." Nora straightened and looked at him directly. "The community's resources come with conditions attached. I've seen what those conditions look like." Something shifted in the Reverend's expression. Not guilt, but something adjacent to it. He left without further comment. A group of young men came on the 9th day and stood in a loose cluster at the rise, passing a flask and making bets about how long she would last. One of them had a notebook, writing down names and amounts with the satisfied air of a man who considers himself a realist. Eli watched them from a distance. Later, eating the thin soup Nora had made from dried beans and a piece of salt pork Ruth Calloway had left without explanation the previous morning, he asked a question. "Mama, are we poor?" Nora looked around the chamber. The fire, the organized supplies, the wall she had rebuilt twice to get the angle right, the flat stone Eli used as a desk for the lessons she gave him each afternoon, teaching from memory because they had no books, and she had spent years filling her memory with things worth keeping. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We are rich in what matters." Eli considered this. Then he picked up the piece of slate he had found near the entrance, a good flat piece, smooth enough to write on, and returned to the arithmetic problem she had set him. Nora watched him and thought, "What skills do you have that you might not even realize? What knowledge is sitting in you right now, waiting for the moment it becomes necessary?" Hank Bridger came on the 5th day and left without speaking. He appeared at the edge of the excavation in the late afternoon when the light was going gray and Nora was too tired to look up immediately. When she did, she saw a broad man in a working coat carrying a canvas sack. He set the sack down at the edge, looked at her for a moment, not with contempt, not with pity, with something more complicated than either, and walked away without a word. Inside the sack, 4 iron brackets, hand-forged and precisely made, worth more in practical terms than anything else she had received. She used them the next morning. He came back on the 8th day with a length of iron rod and a coil of wire, set them down, left without speaking. Eli watched from across the chamber and then looked at his mother with an expression that was trying to be neutral, but wasn't quite managing it. On the 11th day, Hank came while Nora was working on the fire chamber's second flue adjustment, and this time he stayed. "You've got the angle wrong," he said, not unkindly. Nora sat back on her heels. "I know. I've been trying to find the correct degree." "My father was a miner," Hank said. He crouched beside her and examined the flue with the practical attention of someone who sees problems as things to solve rather than judge. "He built a system like this once, up north. Said the angle needs to be steeper than you think. The smoke wants to travel horizontally. You have to convince it otherwise." He adjusted the positioning. He moved with the quiet competence of a man who has spent decades working with his hands and learned to trust what they know. They tested the new angle. The smoke rose correctly, cleanly, without hesitation. Hank stood and looked around the chamber. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your father knew this ground." It was not a question. Nora looked at him. "You knew my father?" Something moved across Hank Bridger's face. something that had been waiting a long time for the right moment and had decided in this fire-lit chamber under the earth that the moment had arrived. "My father knew him," he said carefully. "They worked this ground together, years back. Before everything—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "My father always said William Vance was the best man he ever worked beside." A pause. "They were not enemies at first, your father and Aldrich Holt," Hank continued. "My father said there was a time, early on, when Holt actually respected him. That made what happened later harder to understand." Then he picked up his tools and left, quickly, as if he had said more than he intended. Nora stood in the chamber after he was gone and felt the weight of the unfinished sentence settle around her. Before everything. Before what? Before her father disappeared. Before the silence that no one in her family had ever fully explained. She looked at the tin box, still locked, still waiting against the wall. Before everything. The crisis came on the 14th day, and it came in the form of a man with papers. Nora was outside when Aldrich Holt arrived, carrying wood up from the lower hillside. She heard the horse before she saw the riders, Aldrich and 2 other men, one of whom she recognized as someone who made his living delivering other people's decisions. Aldrich sat his horse and looked down at her with the expression she was beginning to understand was simply his face when he was near her. Satisfaction so deep it had become structural. "The mine property," he said, "is registered under a deed of transfer signed by your father, assigning all rights and title to the Holt family. You are currently occupying land that does not belong to you." Nora set down the wood. Her hands were steady. "I would like to see that deed." Papers were produced. She read carefully. Her father's name was on the document. The signature below it was less certain. Her father had a distinctive hand, angular and precise. The hand of a man who had taught himself to write from a single book, and had never forgotten that literacy was a gift worth using well. The signature on the deed was not that hand. It was close, but it was not right. "I'll need time to review this properly," she said. "You have until the end of the week," Aldrich said, "after which the county will have grounds to remove you by force, and—" He paused, saving the sharpest thing for last. "There is also the matter of the boy's welfare. A child living in an excavation without proper shelter. That is a concern the county takes seriously." He looked at her as he said it, and she understood that this was the real weapon. Not the deed. Not the land. Eli. She watched them ride away and stood very still for a long moment on the frozen hillside, the forged deed in her hands, the cold working its way through her coat. That night, after Eli was asleep, she sat alone beside the dying fire with a sheet of paper and a stub of pencil, doing the calculation she had been avoiding. If she signed away the land, simply left, Eli would be warm. She could take him to a town further north where no one knew them, start again, find work teaching. The choice that cost her everything but kept him safe. She picked up the pencil. She held it for a long time. Then Eli turned in his sleep and murmured something she could not quite hear, and she set the pencil down because the voice she had heard in his sound was not his voice. It was his father's. "Don't," Marcus Vance had said, in the last good year before the illness took him. "Don't ever let them make you small. You are not small." In the morning, Eli woke and found her sitting in the same place. "Did you sleep, Mama?" "A little." He looked at her with his father's eyes and his grandfather's stillness. Papa said you were the brave one, he said, not performing it, just stating it the way he stated arithmetic results, as a fact he had verified and found reliable. I don't want to leave. I want to stay here and keep building. Nora looked at her son. She put the paper in the fire. A shelf built from salvaged timber held the food stores in organized rows. A second shelf, lower, held Eli's lessons, the slate, the stub of chalk she had found in her coat pocket from the schoolroom, a collection of flat stones he had sorted by size and color with the systematic thoroughness of a child who has discovered that organizing one small thing feels like controlling a much larger world. Greta Anders had come once, quietly, in the early morning, and left a bundle of cloth without knocking. There was no door yet, but she had paused at the entrance as if there were one, out of a courtesy that Nora found more moving than she expected. The cloth made 2 additional blankets, which Nora folded and placed at the foot of the sleeping area with the care she would have given something purchased. Ruth Calloway came weekly, always before the town was properly awake, always leaving before Nora had time to say more than thank you. She brought food. Once, she brought a small square of mirror glass, which Nora hung on the wall at eye level because small dignities are not small. Once, she brought a small bundle of dried herbs wrapped in paper, without explanation, the kind of herbs that reduce fever in children. Nora understood the message contained in them without needing it spoken aloud. Ruth was one of the women who had spent their lives conducting the town's real business, not the official business of councils and deeds and public proclamations, but the actual business of who ate when they were hungry, who was checked on when they were ill, who was quietly told which situation required attention. She had been doing this for decades. She had seen many things, and she had learned that the most useful response to most things was a covered dish left at a doorstep before the town was awake to form opinions about it. She never said she believed Nora would succeed. She never said she thought Nora was right. She just came, week after week, and left what she brought, and that was its own kind of statement, more durable than opinion. Eli found the mirror one morning and looked at his own reflection for a long moment. "I look older," he said. "You've been working hard," Nora told him. "Is that what makes you look older? Working hard?" Sometimes it's just the light." He accepted this and went back to his stones. Hank Bridger came again on the 16th day, and this time he sat down. He settled on the low bench Nora had constructed from flat stones and a piece of timber, and he looked at the fire chamber with the expression of a man reviewing his own work. "It's holding well," he said. "It is. Thank you for the angle correction." A silence settled, not uncomfortable. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the upper hill with a sound between breathing and speaking. Then Hank said, "There's something I should have told you already." He looked at his hands. That gesture she was coming to understand was where he went when something cost him something. "My father worked this mine with your father," he said, "for 3 seasons. They were friends, the kind of friends men make when they work underground together and trust each other in ways you can't manage above ground. When the deed transfer happened, the Holt deed, my father was there. He saw what happened. He saw your father sit down with Aldrich Holt, and he saw—" He stopped. The fire shifted. A log settled. "He saw it wasn't willing," Hank said. "Your father's signature. It wasn't given freely. My father knew. He always knew." Nora did not move. "He didn't say anything," Hank said. "He was afraid. He had a family. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that for a long time." He looked up at her finally, and his face held the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for decades and has finally decided to set it down. He died without saying anything. I've been trying to figure out what to do about that ever since. The fire between them was small and steady and real. Is that why you brought the brackets? Nora asked. Yes. And the rod. And the wire. Yes. Why tell me now? Hank was quiet for a moment. Then, because you're still here. I kept waiting for you to leave, and you didn't. I think my father would have wanted me to say it to someone who could use it. Eli appeared in the inner passage, arriving with the unerring timing children have for important moments. He looked at Hank. He looked at his mother. He sat down beside Soot with the composure of a child who has learned that adults sometimes need witnesses. I'll help however I can, Hank said, for whatever it's worth after all this time. It's worth a good deal, actually, Nora said. She meant the information. She meant the brackets and the rod and the corrected flue angle and the oats on the shelf. She meant all of it together, the accumulated weight of small things offered without fanfare to a woman who had been told repeatedly that no one was coming. Outside, the pines continued their conversation with the wind. The tin box sat against the wall, locked and waiting, and Nora Vance, who had been told she was nothing, sat in the home she had built from nothing, and understood, for the first time in a long time, that the ground beneath her was solid, not because circumstances had changed, because she had not. Emmett Doane came on a gray morning with his hat in his hands and his coat buttoned wrong, which was how Nora knew before he spoke that the news was not good. He was a young lawyer with the careful manner of a man who had learned early that precision was a form of protection. Ruth Calloway had sent him quietly through the kind of arrangement that women in small towns conduct below the level of official notice, the way water finds its way through stone, not dramatically, but persistently, and always towards somewhere lower and more useful. He stood at the entrance to the chamber and turned his hat in his hands and said, "I have to stop." Nora was at the workbench she had constructed along the east wall, sorting the last of the dried provisions into portions. She finished the portion she was measuring, set it aside, and then turned to look at him. "Tell me why." "Aldrich Holt came to my office yesterday evening." Emmett's voice was steady, but his hands were not. "He has acquaintances on the licensing board. He was very specific about what he could arrange and how quickly." He stopped. "I am not brave enough for this. I want you to know that I know that. I'm sorry." He had been careful, at least, about that much. The papers had never been in his office, never been anywhere Aldrich Holt could reach them. He had kept them at his mother's house, in a box under her sewing table, which was perhaps the one genuinely brave thing he managed. He set the bundle on the flat stone near the entrance, offered as a partial apology for what he was unable to finish. Then he put his hat back on and left, quickly, the way people leave when they are ashamed of themselves and know that staying longer will not improve the situation. Nora stood in the chamber after the sound of his footsteps had faded, and she allowed herself, for exactly the length of time it took the fire to shift and settle, to feel the full weight of it. The ally gone. The legal avenue closed. The isolation that had been manageable when it was circumstantial, now deliberate and enforced. Eli was outside with Soot, gathering dry timber from the upper hillside. She could hear the distant sound of him talking to the dog. the running commentary that children provide to animals who have earned their trust, and the sound of it, ordinary and alive, moved her from stillness back into motion. She picked up the bundle of papers Emmett had left. She sat beside the fire and read. He had found more than she expected. The deed transfer was fraudulent. She had already suspected this, had seen it in the wrongness of the signature, but Emmett had documented it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that suspicion without evidence is only suffering. He had found a witness statement, decades old, from a man who had worked in the county records office and remembered the filing because something about it had not sat right. The haste of it, the lack of usual procedural steps, the way the Holt representative had come in at closing time when the regular clerk was absent. She read it carefully. Then she set it aside and picked up the next document. And then she found the reference, not the tin box itself. She had been looking at that box for weeks now, the locked box with her father's initials scratched into its surface. But in Emmett's papers, she found a notation in an old property survey, handwritten in the margin in faded ink, referencing a cache of documents left by a W. Vance at the northern excavation for safekeeping against the day they are needed. Her father had not simply disappeared and left nothing. He had planned for exactly this. He had left evidence here, in the ground, in this chamber, in the box she had been sleeping 5 feet away from for weeks. She crossed to it immediately. The lock was the old kind, a simple mechanism designed for discretion rather than security. She had examined it before, without the right tool. Now she looked at it with different eyes, the eyes of a woman who had spent weeks learning to solve problems with what was present rather than what was missing. The iron rod Hank had left. A small one, thin enough. It took 4 minutes. The lock gave. Inside the box, 3 documents, folded carefully, wrapped in oilskin against moisture, preserved with the deliberate care of a man who understood that paper is fragile, and truth even more so. The first was a deed, the original deed, predating Aldrich Holt's version by several years, establishing William Vance as the rightful owner of the mining claim. His signature on this document was his actual signature, angular, precise, unmistakable. The contrast with the forged transfer document was immediate and absolute. The second was a letter from a mining surveyor confirming that a secondary seam discovered during the original excavation gave the claim significantly more value than the initial assessment. This was why Aldrich had wanted it. Not out of casual greed, out of calculated, specific greed, the kind that requires planning and patience and the willingness to do harm with paperwork. The third document was a letter in her father's hand, not addressed to anyone specific. Addressed, it seemed, to whoever found it. Nora unfolded it slowly. She read it once. Then she sat very still for a long time. Then she read it again. William Vance had not disappeared. He had been told to leave, and he had understood that the instruction was not negotiable. Aldrich Holt, in those years, had been a man of growing influence and no particular restraint, and what he had communicated to William Vance, through intermediaries, through methods that left no documentation, was simple. Leave the county, and your family will be unharmed. Stay, and the harm would be specific, and it would fall not on William, but on the people he loved. He had made the calculation that a man makes when he has been stripped of all choices except the one that costs him everything. He had left. But before he left, he had taken the original deed and the surveyor's letter and the evidence of what had been done to him, and he had brought them to this ground. he understood better than anyone, and he had locked them in a box and scratched his initials into the lid, and he had written a letter that said, "If you find this, the mine is yours by right. I could not stay to fight for it, but I left you what you need to win. I never stopped. I want whoever reads this to know that. I never stopped." The letter did not say, "I never stopped loving you." It did not name her. It had been written for whoever came, not knowing who that would be. But Nora knew. She knew because she recognized the handwriting, and she recognized the precision, and she recognized the particular quality of a man who expresses love through practical preparation rather than declaration, who says, "I left you what you need," rather than "I miss you." Because for some people, those phrases mean exactly the same thing. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Outside, Eli's voice carried down the passage, asking Soot an unanswerable question about squirrels with the philosophical curiosity of a child who genuinely wants to understand how the world is organized. I never stopped. Nora folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the oilskin, returned it to the box, and closed the lid. Then she stood up and wiped her face with the back of her hand, the practical gesture of a woman who allows herself to feel things completely and then decides what to do next. There was a great deal to do next. She noticed the signs 3 days later. She had been watching the sky for weeks in the way her father had taught her, not as a forecast, because forecasts were for people who needed certainty, and the sky did not offer certainty. As a reading, as a text written in pressure and movement and the behavior of things that understood the atmosphere better than any instrument. The birds moved wrong, not south. They had already gone south. These were the winter birds, the ones that stayed, and they were moving laterally, trading altitude for distance in a pattern she associated with something her father had described once as the sky reorganizing itself before a serious conversation. The temperature had dropped 2 nights running, not gradually but in steps. A sharp fall, a brief leveling, another sharp fall, different from the steady decline of ordinary winter cold. Ordinary winter cold was a slow negotiation. This felt like a decision already made, working its way down from somewhere high and indifferent to what it found when it arrived. Soot would not settle. He moved from the entrance to the inner chamber, and back in a circuit he repeated without apparent purpose, pausing at the entrance each time to test the air with his nose, his body carrying the specific kind of restlessness that was not boredom, but information. The air itself had changed. Something she felt in the subtle pressure behind her ears, a sensitivity her father had described as the miner's sixth sense, bought with years underground, dense, anticipatory, like a held breath before something large commits to moving. Nora set down her work and went into town. She went to Silas Webb first, because his store was the center of the town's practical life. "There's weather coming," she told him. "Serious weather, not the usual winter. Something heavier. You need to increase your fuel stores and check your roof framing, particularly the north side." Silas regarded her with the amused tolerance he had settled into for her, as if she were a child who persisted in an interesting but manageable delusion. "Winter weather in winter," he said. "My thanks for the bulletin. The birds have been—" "The mole woman is scared of sunshine," said a voice from the back of the store. One of the young men, leaning against the counter with the studied ease of someone performing confidence for an audience. There was laughter. She did not respond to the laughter. She finished what she had to say to Silas. Specific, practical, the kind of information that could be acted on, and went to the next house. She went to every house that would receive her, which was fewer than she had hoped. At the boarding house, the proprietress listened politely and said she would take it under advisement with an expression that meant she would not. At the edge of the Anders property, she spoke to Greta through a partially open door, and Greta listened more carefully than the others, but said her husband had assessed the winter as ordinary, and she trusted his judgment. She went to the church. Reverend Stokes received her in the small room behind the main hall. He listened with the patience of a man practiced at hearing things he had already decided how to categorize. "The natural world is God's creation," he said when she finished. "Its patterns are in His hands, not readable by instruments or personal intuition." "I'm not asking you to believe in my intuition," Nora said. "I'm asking you to store more wood and check your window seals. Those are practical actions with practical value regardless of what causes the need for them." "I appreciate your concern," he said, in the tone that means the conversation is over. Outside, the sky had taken on a color she did not like. A yellowish gray, like an old bruise, still deciding how dark it intended to become. She stood on the church steps and looked at it for a moment. Then she went home. The storm announced itself that night, not with wind, but with silence. The sounds of the winter dark, the movement of animals, the distant complaint of frozen timber, the small voices of cold air finding gaps in walls. All of it simply stopped, as if the world had drawn in a breath and was holding it. Nora woke at the moment the silence began. She lay still and listened to it, not peaceful, not the stillness of late night, but the stillness of suspension, of something enormous pausing before it commits to its full intention. She rose without waking Eli, went to the entrance passage, and stood at its mouth looking out. The sky was invisible behind cloud, a coverage without seam or variation, as if the sky itself had been replaced by something else entirely. The cold that came off it felt different. Not the familiar cold of the season, but something with weight and purpose. A cold that felt like a structural element rather than a weather condition. She went back inside. She fed the fire carefully, adding the larger pieces of timber she had been saving, building the chamber's heat reserve rather than its immediate warmth. She checked the flue. She checked the entrance barrier. She checked the water supply and the food stores. Running calculations she had kept current in the back of her mind, the way a navigator keeps reckoning without pausing to write it down. She was as prepared as preparation allowed. By mid-morning, the wind began. It arrived at its full intensity within an hour. Not the familiar complaint of winter wind, but something closer to intention. A force that seemed not merely to be moving through the world, but asserting something about it. The pines on the upper hillside, present and audible every day of her time here, disappeared into the noise completely, their individual voices absorbed into something larger and less interested in distinction. The sound of it, even muffled through the earth, was extraordinary. Not simply howling. Something with more variety than that. Something that shifted in pitch and character the way a voice shifts when it is saying more than one thing at once. It screamed in the upper registers when it found gaps in the terrain. It dropped to a low, sustained note that moved through the stone walls and into the body, felt more than heard. It percussed against the entrance barrier in irregular rhythms that sounded, in certain moments, disturbingly like knocking. In the chamber, the effect was muffled. The earth absorbed the chaos with the patient indifference of something that had experienced many thousands of storms over many thousands of years, and found them, ultimately, unpersuasive. The contrast with the world above was total. Inside, the fire held its specific warmth. The air was still, not motionless, but slow, the way breath moves in a sleeping room. The temperature, built over weeks of careful management, held steady. Not comfortable by the standards of a properly heated house, but stable, consistent, livable. Exactly what the system had been designed to produce. Nora had understood, from the beginning, that the goal was not comfort, but control. You cannot always be comfortable. You can, if you build correctly, be in command of your conditions rather than at their mercy. The difference between those two states, in a serious winter, was everything. The temperature held. The fire burned. Eli sat with his slate and his chalk and the arithmetic problem she had given him that morning, working through it with focused concentration. His way of managing fear. Not denying it, but channeling it into something that had a correct answer, which the storm above them did not. Soot lay at the entrance to the passage and did not move from it, facing outward, which was where his understanding of his purpose placed him. Time passed. The storm did not. She hoped they had listened. She did not believe they had. The first knock came 3 hours after full dark. She heard it through the passage. The hard, repeated knock of someone for whom welcome had become irrelevant, replaced by something more urgent. She took the lantern and went to the entrance. She pushed the barrier aside and opened the passage to the night. Silas Webb stood there with his youngest child in his arms, a girl of perhaps 3 years, whose lips had taken on the color that lips take on when the body has been making impossible choices about where to send its warmth. Behind him, his wife, one arm wrapped around her own body and the other reaching back toward him. Silas Webb looked at Nora. He looked at her the way a man looks when everything he has used to define himself, his certainty, his position, his comfortable amusement at the efforts of people he considered beneath his notice, has been removed by a force more honest than his opinions. He looked reduced and he looked frightened, and beneath both of those things, he looked like what he actually was, a man who had made a mistake about who mattered and was only now understanding the full cost of it. He did not speak. He held out his daughter. "Come in," Nora said. "Get warm." She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything except those 4 words, because those were the only words that served any purpose in that moment. She took the child from his arms, moved immediately to the fire chamber, and began the careful, steady warming her father had taught her. Not fast, because fast warming causes its own damage, but consistent and thorough and focused. "Sit down," she told the parents. "There's water heating." They sat. The Anders family arrived within the hour. Greta, her husband, and their 2 older children, their roof having shed a significant portion of its structure under the weight of rapidly accumulating snow. Greta came through the entrance and looked at Nora and said, simply and completely, "I should have listened to you." Not elaborating, not qualifying, just stating it, the way a fact is stated when it has become undeniable. Nora gave her a blanket and put her to work, because people given something useful to do in a crisis recover faster than people who are only given shelter. Reverend Stokes came an hour after that, alone, without ceremony, without the particular authority he carried in ordinary circumstances. He had left it somewhere between his doorstep and this hillside. What he brought instead was a quieter thing. The look of a man who has been genuinely humbled, not by embarrassment, which is only wounded pride, but by genuine encounter with the limits of what he knew. He stood at the entrance and looked at the chamber, the fire, the organized space, the people arranged within it with the purposeful calm of a place that had been built for exactly this kind of occupancy. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came in. Aldrich Holt arrived last. She heard his footsteps in the passage, a sound she recognized because she had been aware of his particular way of moving since the day she had understood what he had done and what he was capable of doing. He came through the entrance alone. The storm had stripped him of the trappings that usually accompanied him. The fine coat was present, but no longer fine, soaked and rigid with cold. The authority that usually surrounded him as visibly as the coat simply absent, left behind somewhere in the white chaos outside. He was carrying something, a child, a small girl, perhaps 4 years old, wrapped in the remnants of a wool blanket, her face the color of winter sky and her breath shallow but present. His granddaughter, the only child remaining in the Holt family after a season that had already taken more than it should have. He did not speak. He looked at Nora with the expression of a man who has been emptied out by circumstances and is presenting himself and what he values most to whatever judgment awaits. He held the child out. Not a transaction, not a negotiation, just, here is what matters. Please. Nora looked at the child. She looked at Aldrich Holt. She looked at the child again. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." She took the girl from his arms and carried her to the fire chamber, and she began, again, the careful and necessary work of bringing someone back from the edge of the cold. Behind her, Aldrich Holt stepped through the entrance of the chamber that had been built from nothing, on ground that had been stolen from her father, using knowledge that no one in this town had valued until tonight. There would be time for words. There would be time for the reckoning that was owed and the accounting that would follow and the long, complicated work of what came after. But not tonight. Tonight the storm was still speaking in the language of the world above. And in the world below, 18 people sat in the warmth that one woman had built, and the fire held, and the ground held, and the darkness outside could do what darkness does. Press against the walls and find them solid, and have nothing to show for it but the wait for morning. The tin box sat against the wall with its secrets already given, its locks already opened, and Nora Vance, who had been told she was nothing, tended the fire she had built in the ground her father had prepared, and took care of the people who had failed to take care of her, because that was the kind of woman she was. Not because circumstances had made her that way, but because she had chosen it again and again in every small and large decision of a life that had been harder than it needed to be, and more valuable than anyone except her had understood. Outside, the storm continued its work. Inside, the ground held. 18 people in a space built for one. That was the arithmetic of it. And arithmetic, Nora had always believed, was simply the truth in its most patient form. You could argue with opinions. You could dispute interpretations. But numbers presented themselves without apology and waited to be addressed. 18 people, one fire chamber, a food supply calculated for a woman and a child through the remainder of a hard season. Water from the deep seepage point, reliable but slow. Air that moved correctly through the flue system, but had not been designed to process the breath of nearly 20 human beings. She did the calculations while warming Aldrich's granddaughter, her hands moving through the practiced motions of careful rewarming while her mind worked the numbers with the systematic focus that had kept her alive for the past weeks. It was manageable, not comfortable. Manageable was a different thing. And right now, manageable was everything. She stood and turned to face the chamber. 18 people looked back at her with varying degrees of fear, exhaustion, and the particular humility of people who have been proven wrong about something important and are still too cold to know how to address it. "Listen carefully," Nora said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "We have enough of everything we need if we use it correctly. Water before food, always. Warm slowly, not fast. The people nearest the walls need to rotate toward the center every 2 hours. Nobody goes past the entrance passage without telling me first." No one argued. 3 weeks ago, half these people would have argued as a reflex. The cold had edited that impulse out of them. "Silas, there's timber stacked in the left alcove. You're responsible for keeping the fire fed. Medium pieces. Consistent heat is more valuable than intense heat." Silas Webb nodded once without his usual layering of expression. Just the nod. It was perhaps the most honest communication they had ever exchanged. "Greta, the water tin is in the rear passage, second left. It fills slowly. Check it every hour and bring forward what's collected. Heat it over the secondary stones before drinking. Not boiling, just warm." Greta moved immediately, without waiting for the sentence to finish, which told Nora something useful about who she could rely on. She assigned tasks to everyone capable of performing one, because a task does two things simultaneously. It contributes to survival, and it gives the person performing it something to do with their hands, which is the fastest remedy for panic Nora knew of. Idle hands in a crisis don't rest. They tremble. The reverend she put in charge of the children, all 4 of them, gathered near the warmest corner of the chamber. He sat among them with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who had arrived at an unfamiliar assignment and was discovering, with some surprise, that he was capable of it. The youngest child, Silas's daughter, had been revived enough to look around with the wide, assessing eyes of a very young person trying to determine whether her current situation was safe. The Reverend told her a story, something simple about animals and seasons, and the child leaned against his side and listened, and after a while her eyes stopped working so hard. Hank Bridger arrived an hour after Aldrich. He was snow-covered and entirely calm, the calm of a man who had spent his professional life working with materials under stress and understood that panic was just energy without direction. He had come from his forge, which had lost its chimney cap to the wind but had otherwise held, and he had brought what he could carry, tools primarily, and also a length of rope and a sealed tin of rendered fat that became, within the hour, fuel for the secondary heating stones. He looked at the chamber, at its occupants, at the organized activity Nora had set in motion, and then he looked at Nora with an expression she had no immediate category for. Something between recognition and something more personal, something that required a quieter moment than this one to examine properly. "What do you need?" he asked. "The entrance barrier needs reinforcing. The wind is finding the gaps. Use the spare timber from the right alcove, and the wire on the second shelf. He went to work without another word. The hours passed unevenly, some of them enormous, and some collapsed into nothing. Time behaving less like a measurement and more like a quality, thick in some places and thin in others. The storm above did not relent. They could hear it, not clearly. The earth absorbed most of the sound, but as a presence, a low vibration that moved through the stone occasionally like a memory of force rather than force itself. The barrier held. The fire held. People began, gradually, and then more completely, to warm. There is a particular moment in the recovery from serious cold when the body crosses back over some threshold, and the person inhabiting it becomes recognizably themselves again. Not the reduced, frightened version that cold produces, but the full version with opinions and memories and the specific quality of their ordinary personality. Nora watched it happen, and each person through the evening could identify the moment it occurred. A small change in posture, a breath that was different from the previous breath, eyes that were present rather than simply open. When it happened in Silas Webb's daughter, the child looked up at the Reverend and asked with perfect conversational normalcy whether the dog had a name. "Soot," said Eli from across the chamber, without looking up from the arithmetic he had returned to with the focused persistence of a child who had decided that the best response to extraordinary circumstances was to continue being himself. "Why soot?" "Because he's black, like soot." The child considered this with the philosophical seriousness of her age. "That's a very good name," she said. The Reverend caught Nora's eye across the chamber, and something passed between them. Not yet reconciliation, that would take longer, and more words, and probably more than one difficult conversation. But perhaps the precondition for it. The moment with the dog and the Anders girl came in the deep middle of the night, when the storm outside was at whatever passed for its fullest expression, and the chamber had settled into the particular quiet of many people occupying a shared space and having, for the time being, no more argument with one another. The girl's name was Petra. She was 7 years old and had not spoken since her family arrived. Not in fear, Nora assessed, but in the particular withdrawal the body sometimes imposes after significant shock, a conservation of resources that extends to language. She sat between her parents and watched everything with large, careful eyes, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was too complete for a child of her age. Greta had asked Nora quietly, while collecting water, whether it was serious. "Give it time," Nora had said. "Give it warmth. Give it something ordinary." Eli had been watching Petra for an hour with the lateral attention of a child assessing another child's condition without making it visible. Then he stood up, went to where Soot was lying near the fire chamber's base, and picked up the dog with the slightly theatrical effort that Soot's size and dignity required. He crossed the chamber and set Soot down carefully in front of Petra. Soot, who had strong opinions about being moved and generally made them known, said nothing. He looked at the girl. She looked at him. There was a negotiation happening that required no translation. Soot stepped forward and put his chin on her folded hands. The chamber was quiet enough that everyone heard it when 10 minutes later, Petra unfolded her hands and placed them on Soot's neck, and then said, in a voice that was small and entirely present, "Can I keep petting him?" The Reverend turned away. His shoulders moved once. Eli said, "Yes, he likes it behind the ears." Greta Anders made a sound that was not quite words, and her husband put his arm around her, and Nora looked at the fire and allowed the moment to be what it was, One of those moments that proves nothing and explains nothing and simply insists, with all the weight of its own smallness, that something worth protecting is still here. Can you imagine? 18 people who had called her nothing, sheltered by the woman they had dismissed. And this, a child's voice, a dog's patience, was what broke the silence of the storm. The night deepened. The storm persisted. People slept in arrangements that would have been unthinkable a day before. The Reverend's coat spread over 3 sleeping children, Silas Webb's wife sharing a blanket with Greta Anders, men who had been commercial rivals for years, lying 6 inches apart on the same bedding because the alternative was cold, and cold was no longer abstract. Hank had finished reinforcing the entrance barrier, checked the flue twice, and made himself useful in 6 or 7 small ways that added up to something significant. He did it without announcement, the purest form of usefulness, the kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. When the chamber was as settled as it was going to be, Hank came and sat beside Nora near the fire. Not close, exactly. Just beside. She was tired in a way that went beyond the physical. The tiredness of someone who has been holding everything together through an act of sustained will, and is now in the small space between one crisis and whatever came next, allowing herself to notice how heavy it had been. They sat without speaking for a while. The fire shifted. Outside, the storm continued its long conversation with the world above. "Your father would have done exactly this," Hank said eventually. Not to comfort her. As a statement of fact, offered the way Hank offered most things, directly, without decoration. "You think so?" "I know so. I heard enough stories from my father to know what kind of man William Vance was. The kind who prepared for other people. The kind who thought about what others would need before he thought about what he needed." She was quiet for a moment. "I found the letter," she said, "in the box. He wrote that he never stopped." Hank nodded slowly. The nod meant, "I believe that." It also meant, "I'm sorry it took so long for you to know it." His hand was on the stone beside her. Hers was near it. At some point, she couldn't have identified the exact moment, which was perhaps the nature of such things. The distance between them closed, and his hand was over hers, not pressing, just present. The warmth of it was specific and distinct from the warmth of the fire, which was general and impersonal. This was different. Neither of them spoke about it. There was nothing to say that the gesture had not already said more precisely. "I should have come sooner," he said. "The first day, not the 5th. "You came," she said. "That was enough." "It wasn't." "It was enough to build from," she said. "That's what enough means. Not perfect. Just sufficient to begin." He looked at her, and she felt the look without meeting it directly. Warmth and light registering at the periphery. The temperature of a thing she didn't yet need to measure precisely. Eli turned in his sleep across the chamber and made a small sound. Not distress, just a child deeply present in a dream. And both of them looked at him without thinking, the automatic orientation of adults toward a sleeping child. "He's remarkable," Hank said. "He is," Nora agreed. Without qualification, without the modest deflection that the comment might have invited. She knew what her son was. She was not interested in performing humility about it. A long silence settled between them, the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who have been doing important things side by side and no longer need to fill the space between them with words. Outside, the storm continued its particular language. Inside, the fire held, and in the quiet between two people who had both lost important things and were sitting, for the first time, with some tentative hope that loss was not the last word, something settled. Not romance yet. Something earlier than that. The recognition that the other person was real, was present, was someone whose company made the difficult things slightly more bearable. Sometimes that is where it starts. Sometimes that is enough to start with. "Tell me about your father," she said, "what you remember." Hank was quiet for a moment, surprised. Then, "He had big hands, bigger than mine. He used to say the measure of a craftsman wasn't in what he built alone, but in what the next person could build on top of it." He paused. "He said he learned that from your father." Nora listened. Hank talked. The fire burned between them, steady and sufficient. In the morning, when the chamber began to stir and the business of another difficult day began to assert itself, both of them moved back into their separate functions without comment. There was nothing to discuss yet. Things that matter, Nora had always believed, should be given time to become what they are going to be before they are required to have a name. The ground was patient with everything that grew in it. She had learned over the past weeks to be patient in the same way. Midway through the night, Aldrich Holt approached her. He came quietly, so as not to wake the others, and lowered himself onto the flat stone across from where she sat. He did not carry the authority he usually wore in her presence. He had left that somewhere in the cold, and it showed on him, the way certain absences show more clearly than presences. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the fire. "Your father asked me once to be a better man," he said finally. "Not as a confession exactly, more as a statement of record, something that had been true for a very long time, and was now being named. Before everything went wrong between us, there was a time, early on, when I respected him." He paused. "I failed him instead. I've known that every day since." Nora did not move. "My son is gone," Aldrich said. "My daughter-in-law. The child is all that remains of them." He looked at the small girl sleeping near the fire, soot now lying against her back. "I brought her to your door because she was the only thing I have done correctly in a very long time, and I could not bear to have her go the way everything else has gone." For the first time, Nora saw him clearly, not the figure of authority and menace she had constructed from her own necessity, but a man who had made a series of choices and lived in the diminishing world those choices had produced. A man who had chosen wrong once and had not been able to find his way back. She did not soften toward him. That was not what the moment required, but she saw him. And seeing someone clearly is a different thing from forgiving them. Sometimes it must come first. "Your granddaughter will be well," Nora said. "She and Eli have already come to an arrangement about the dog. She is welcome here." Something moved in his face that he did not try to conceal. He returned to his corner without another word. She watched him settle, watched him pull the edge of a blanket around his shoulders, watched him become, for the first time in her experience of him, simply a tired old man trying to stay warm. The fever had been climbing again since midnight. Eli had not said anything about it, which was how she knew. He had her habit of managing his own difficulty quietly, presenting only what was necessary, which was useful in general and dangerous in specific circumstances. She had noticed the warmth in his forehead when she last checked on him, moved him closer to the fire, added a second layer of covering. She checked him again every hour. It was not the severe fever of the first week, not the fever that had required everything she had to fight. But it was present, and it was climbing. And she tracked it the way she tracked the fire, consistently, without drama, alert for any change. She sat with him in the late hours, her back against the stone wall, Eli's head against her shoulder, his breathing audible and measured. She began to sing very quietly, the song her mother had sung to her in the years before her mother's health had failed. Not a formal song, not something with a title and a history, just a melody assembled from pieces her mother had heard and kept, a private song that had never existed anywhere except in that family's keeping. She had sung it to Eli since he was an infant. He knew it without knowing he knew it, the way people know things that have been present since before consciousness began. Around her, the chamber breathed. The fire held its temperature with the reliability of something correctly built, not dramatic, not effortful, simply present and consistent and sufficient. Before the first gray light found its way down the entrance passage, Eli's fever broke. She felt it happen, a change in the quality of his warmth, the sharp heat giving way to something more ordinary, the body returning from its emergency to its regular operations. His breathing deepened and slowed. His weight against her shoulder became heavier, the particular heaviness of genuine sleep. She sat with him a while longer after that, allowing the relief to move through her completely, rather than setting it aside for later, the way she had been setting things aside for later since this whole long season had begun. 17 people alive in a space built for one. The ground had held. She leaned her head back against the stone and looked at the fire and thought about her father, who had prepared this ground for her without knowing it was her, who had understood that preparation is a form of love and that love, properly expressed, outlasts the person who gives it. She thought, I finished what he began. The ground beneath her was solid. It had always been solid. She had simply needed to come back to it, and she let herself, for the length of one slow breath, rest. The storm ended the way all long stories end, not with a final declaration, but with a gradual absence. The wind thinned first, not all at once, not dramatically, but by degrees. The low vibration that had been moving through the stone walls for days simply ceased, and the cessation was louder, in its way, than the storm itself had been. Nora felt it in her hands before she heard it. The stone under her palms going still, the constant subliminal trembling that she had stopped consciously registering suddenly absent, like a sound you don't notice until it stops. She rose before anyone else and went to the entrance passage and stood at the mouth of the tunnel and looked out at what the world had become. White, vast and absolute and oddly peaceful, the way destruction sometimes looks in the aftermath. Not beautiful, exactly, but honest. The familiar shapes of the hillside had been replaced by new ones, rounder and heavier and more patient than what had been there before. The trees that were still standing wore the snow the way old people wear certain burdens, not broken by it, but visibly shaped. The ones that had not survived lay at angles the wind had chosen for them. This hold was still considerable, but different, dry and still, without the tearing insistence of the storm, just the ordinary cold of deep winter, present and known and manageable. She stood for a long moment in the early gray light and breathed. Then she went back inside, because there was work to do, and work was how she answered everything. They emerged through the morning in ones and twos, blinking in the flat white light with the slightly disoriented expressions of people returning from somewhere that had operated by different rules. The world was still present, largely intact, waiting without judgment for them to determine what came next. The town had taken damage. Some roofs had surrendered sections of themselves to the weight of accumulated snow. The boarding house had lost its porch entirely. A wall on the east side had come partially down, but the structures themselves, the core of them, had held, not because they had been well prepared nor anew, but because the storm's duration had been finite and the margin had been sufficient. She was glad of it. She had not wanted to be right about the worst version of what she had warned them about. She had wanted to be wrong. Being right about a disaster was never the victory people who had not experienced it imagined it to be. She thought of Josiah Pratt immediately. He lived alone at the southeastern edge of the settlement, in a house he had occupied so long that he and it had become a single concept in people's minds. He had been perhaps the most completely dismissive of her warnings, not cruelly, but with the impenetrable certainty of a man whose survival record had convinced him that his judgment constituted expertise. He had not come to the chamber. She organized a small group, Hank, Silas Webb, the Reverend, and they went to the Pratt house through snow that came to their thighs in the open stretches, taking turns breaking the path. The going was slow and effortful, and no one spoke, because everyone understood where they were going and what they were likely to find, and some knowledge sits better in silence. They found what they had expected to find. Josiah Pratt had made it through the first night and into the second. The wood box had been worked through methodically. The fire fed as long as there was fuel to feed it. He had arranged himself in his chair by the window, his chair worn to the specific shape of his particular habitual sitting, with the blanket from his bed pulled around his shoulders. He had faced the window that looked out toward the north, toward the rise where Nora's chamber was built into the hillside. On the small table beside him, a cup, still sitting where he had sat it last, and beside it, a piece of paper with something written on it in a shaking hand. She did not read it immediately. She looked at the room first. The careful arrangements of a man who lived alone and had organized his life according to his own quiet logic. Tools hung in specific order on the wall, a coat on its specific hook, a pair of boots set side by side at the door, toes pointed outward, waiting for a morning that had not come. She had not known him well. Nobody had, she suspected. He was the kind of man who kept the distance between himself and others at a precise and comfortable remove, not out of hostility, but out of the deep privacy of someone who had learned long ago that the interior life was the one over which he had complete authority. She picked up the paper. 3 words written in the margins of an old receipt. I see it. She stood with it for a long moment, understanding what it meant. In his last hours, facing north toward the rise where she had been dismissed and mocked and proven right, he had seen it. The light in the chamber entrance, the smoke from the correctly angled flue. He had seen it and had not come, whether from stubbornness or from the cold's having already done its worst work on him. She would never know. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket. On the small table beside him, a cup, still sitting where he had sat it last. The kind of detail that accumulates in a life lived alone. an ordinary object waiting for a return that did not come. Nora picked it up and set it carefully on the shelf before they left. It seemed like the right thing to do, though she could not have said exactly why. She stood in the room and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was looking at. Not triumph, not even vindication, just the specific grief of an unnecessary death. A life that had more of itself to spend, spent anyway, because a man had trusted his certainty over someone else's knowledge. She would carry this. She had known she would carry it from the moment she had understood he was not coming. He deserves a proper burial, she said. We'll bring him back. No one argued. They carried him back together, carefully, with the respect that difficult men earn posthumously when the full shape of their stubbornness is finally visible. The reckoning unfolded over days because that is what reckonings do. They don't arrive in a single scene. They accumulate the way snow accumulates, each layer light on its own and significant together. Silas Webb came first, on the afternoon of the day the storm ended. He brought his 2 older sons, each carrying armloads of dry timber, and he set it all down near the chamber entrance and stood looking at Nora. He did not make a speech. He was built for transactions, for the direct exchange of practical things, and he conducted his reckoning in the currency he knew. I put up a sign, he said. I'd like to take it down. It doesn't matter now, Nora told him. It matters to me. He looked at the ground between them. Some things you do that you can't charge against someone else's account. They go on your own books. That sign goes on mine. She nodded. He went and took it down. She heard from Greta Anders later that he had burned it in his own stove, standing there watching it go until there was nothing left. She thought that was probably the right way to dispose of it. He came back after that regularly. Timber, supplies, the practical generosity of a man who had decided that generosity was both possible and necessary for his own continued self-regard. He never made a speech about it. He brought things, set them down, and went back for more. It was, in its way, the most honest form of apology she had ever received. Reverend Stokes made his reckoning publicly, which suited his nature and perhaps was the only form that would have been sufficient. He had spoken against her from a position of public authority, and he addressed it in the same position. He stood before his congregation on the first Sunday after the storm, in a church still showing the winter's passage in its damaged north wall and frost-edged windows, and he spoke for a long time. Not about pride as an abstract concept, not about humility as a spiritual exercise. He spoke about a specific failure committed by himself toward a specific person, and he named her. He said Nora Vance's name in his church from his pulpit, and said she had tried to warn them, and he had dismissed her, and said that dismissal had contributed to at least one death, and could have contributed to many more, and said he was sorry in the plain language that apology requires when it is genuine, without the qualifications and contextualizations that transform admission into something that is still, mostly, about the person doing the admitting. Several people cried. Nora was not there. She heard about it from Greta, who reported it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has watched something difficult be done correctly and completely. Greta herself came 2 mornings later, with Petra at her side. Petra entirely restored, bright-eyed and already half in love with Soot on a permanent basis, and said what she had to say directly, without theater. I should have listened to you when you came to my door. My husband agrees. We both agree. You came when it mattered, Nora said, later than we should have. Yes, but you came, and you helped, and you are here now. That is not nothing, Greta. Greta looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman reassessing something. Then, my husband wants to learn the heating system. He's a builder. He thinks the principle could be applied more broadly. Tell him Thursday, Nora said, and tell him to bring anyone else who wants to learn. Greta nodded. Then she looked at Petra, who had already gravitated to Soot's orbit with the unerring instinct of a child who considers a previous interaction to constitute a binding relationship. Can Soot come to our house sometime? Petra asked without looking up from the dog. On Thursdays, Eli said from across the chamber, with the authority of a child who has appointed himself social secretary for a dog. Soot goes visiting on Thursdays. Aldrich Holt came on the 5th day. She had been expecting him the way you expect the final chapter of a difficult book, with the particular combination of dread and readiness that comes from having understood, for some time, that it must be gotten through and cannot be avoided. He arrived alone. No legal accompaniment, no associates, no props of authority. His coat was good, but carried in it the memory of the storm, the set of a garment that had been through something and had not fully recovered. He was older looking than she remembered, though the interval had not been long. Some experiences compress time in ways that show on a person. He set a document on the flat stone near the entrance without preamble. A legal transfer, properly executed, the mining claim, the property title, the rights in their entirety, signed over to Nora Vance without condition or qualification, witnessed, complete. Then he sat down on the low bench without being invited, and this was the most honest thing he had done in her presence. Not performing, not managing, just present. The deed my family filed was fraudulent, he said. The words came out with the flatness of something stated too many times in the privacy of one's own mind, worn smooth by repetition into something that could finally be said aloud. I was aware of that when it happened. I was aware of it every year after. Nora said nothing. She gave him the space to finish. Your father was a man of uncommon quality, Aldrich said. I recognized that at the time, which is perhaps why I found it easier to remove him than to contend with him. People who are genuinely better than you are difficult to be near. He looked at his hands. That is not a justification. I am explaining, not justifying. A long pause. The fire shifted. Outside, the sound of the settlement resuming itself. Voices at a distance, the sound of shovels working through snow, someone's axe finding a rhythm. My son died, Aldrich said. My daughter-in-law followed. The child is all that remains of them. He was quiet for a moment. I brought her to your door because she was the only thing I have done correctly in a very long time, and I could not bear to have her go the way everything else has gone. Nora looked at him. He looked back, and she saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, what he actually was. Not the figure of authority and menace she had constructed from her own necessity, but a man who had made a series of choices and lived in the diminishing world those choices had produced, carrying the accumulated weight of them silently, constantly, with no opportunity for setting them down. She did not soften toward him. That was not what the moment called for. But she saw him, And seeing someone clearly is a different thing from forgiving them, and sometimes it must come first. Your granddaughter is well, Nora said. She is welcome here. Something moved in his face that he did not try to manage or conceal. He stood. He buttoned his coat with the careful attention of a man performing a small task as a way of composing himself. He was nearly to the entrance when he stopped and turned back. He never stopped, he said. Your father. I want you to know that. His voice had changed, quieter, stripped of everything except what was essential. He wrote to me once after he was gone from here. I don't know how he sent it, from where he was, how he managed it. He asked me to watch over his family. He was asking me to do the thing I had prevented him from being able to do himself. A pause. He said to tell whoever found the box that he never stopped, in case he didn't make it back to say it himself. Nora stood very still. I failed him in that, as I failed him in everything else, Aldrich said. But I wanted you to know that he said it, that he asked me to make sure someone told you. He looked at her directly. I'm telling you now. Too late. But telling you. He left. His footsteps moved through the passage, and then were gone. And the silence he left behind was a different quality of silence than the one that had preceded him. Something had been in the room and was no longer in the room. And the room was different for its having been there and its having left. Before he disappeared, Silas Webb had stood before a gathering of neighbors that same afternoon. He looked at the chamber entrance, and he repeated the words Aldrich had said on the day of the expulsion, but reversed, slowly, as if placing each word with deliberate intention. She had nothing, he said, and she built everything, for every one of us. No one laughed. No one looked away. Nora stood with the knowledge of both men's words for a long time. Her father had not abandoned her. She had known this in her heart since she read his letter. But Aldrich's words added a dimension she hadn't had before. Her father, from wherever he had been, had tried, had reached back, had asked, even of the man who had wronged him, for the care of what he loved. She went to the tin box. She opened it. She took out the letter and read the last line one more time. I never stopped. She held it for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully and returned it to the box. Some things are not meant to be displayed. They are meant to be kept close, taken out when needed, returned to safekeeping after. A private relationship with precious things, more durable than showing them, more like love. Then Silas Webb appeared at the entrance with more timber, and Greta Anders arrived behind him with a covered pot that smelled of something warm and substantial, and Eli came in from the upper hillside with soot at his heels and snow in his hair, announcing that 3 of the young birch trees on the north rise had come through the storm without damage, which he seemed to consider a personal victory. Life continued. It does not wait for grief to complete itself. It continues alongside, which is sometimes its greatest kindness. Spring arrived tentatively, then committed. The ground thawed from the top down, in layers, the way frozen things always thaw. At the surface first, then deeper still, until the cold that had gone all the way through was gone from everywhere. The entrance rise turned green with the particular insistent green of things that have been waiting and are now done waiting. The birches on the north rise leafed out with the cheerful speed of trees that consider spring a personal vindication. Hank built the room. He began without announcement, which was his way. Not secretive, simply not interested in the performance of intention, only in the work itself. He extended the east side of the chamber with the careful, considered construction of a man building something he intends to last through more than one generation. He worked in the early hours and the late ones, the way people work on things that matter to them privately, before and after the ordinary day. He chose the window placement himself, east-facing, which let in the morning light at precisely the angle that illuminated the original chamber's interior, not by accident. He had been watching the light in that chamber for months, had noted how it moved, had built the window to bring more of it. Eli observed the window placement with the analytical attention of a child assembling information toward a conclusion. He came to Nora one evening while she was sorting seeds for the kitchen garden and sat beside her with the carefully casual manner of someone who has something to say and is choosing their moment. "Mr. Bridger built the window east-facing," he said. "Yes. Papa's room faced east. He said he liked to see the morning before the day had a chance to complicate it. Your father was a perceptive man." "Is it all right with you?" Eli asked. "Mr. Bridger, staying." She set down the seeds. She looked at her son, his father's eyes, his grandfather's stillness, his own particular quality of directness that belonged entirely to himself. "Is it all right with you?" she asked. He considered this with appropriate seriousness. He had learned from both the men whose qualities he carried that serious questions deserve serious consideration, and not the performance of an answer arrived at before the question was finished. "Papa said the bravest thing a person can do after losing someone they love is to let someone in again," Eli said finally. "He said people who refuse to do that are protecting themselves from loss by preventing themselves from living." He picked up the seeds and began sorting alongside her. "I think Papa was right about that. He was right about most things." "He was," Nora agreed. "And Mr. Bridger fixed the flu angle," Eli added, with the tone of a man closing a legal argument. "That counts for something?" The wedding was small, which suited both of them entirely. Ruth Calloway brought food, substantial, well-seasoned food, the kind that speaks of someone who has been cooking for important occasions for many decades and understands that feeding people well is itself a form of celebration. She had also, quietly, told a few people, and those people had told a few others. And so the gathering that assembled outside the chamber entrance on that spring morning was larger than either Nora or Hank had anticipated. Not large by the standards of a formal occasion, but full in the way that matters, full of people who had a reason to be there beyond obligation. Greta Anders brought flowers, the early ones, not abundant but carefully chosen and arranged in a tin cup with the unpretentious artistry of a practical woman who knows that beauty doesn't require scale. She had walked the North Rise before dawn to find the best ones, which Nora did not know and which Greta would never mention, because that was exactly the kind of thing Greta Anders did without mentioning. Silas Webb came and stood in the back and said nothing, and that was its own kind of presence. A heavy-set man who had driven a mocking sign into frozen ground now standing at the back of a gathering that celebrated the woman he had mocked, holding his hat in his hands and staying for the whole of it. His daughter was there too, the small one who had asked whether the dog had a name. She had grown enough that she no longer needed to be carried, and she stood beside her father and watched everything with eyes that were taking careful notes for a memory that would last. The Reverend officiated. He did so with a humility that was new to him and sat on him well. the way certain qualities only arrive in people after something difficult has made room for them, arriving not as additions to character, but as revelations of what was always possible. Eli stood beside his mother through the ceremony with Soot's collar in his hand and the expression of a person completing a long and careful assessment. At the appropriate moment, he produced the small nod that meant, "I have examined this thoroughly and find it sound." Hank saw it and turned slightly away for a moment, and when he turned back, his face was composed, but the composition was effortful and visible, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him. After, when people had eaten and talked and the afternoon light was doing the particular thing it does in early spring, tentative and golden, like something that isn't sure yet if it's allowed, Hank sat beside Nora outside the chamber entrance, and they looked out over the settlement below, which was in the process of reassembling itself after the winter, patching and rebuilding, and in several places constructing something new where the old had proven insufficient. "I keep thinking about the things I should have done differently," he said. "Earlier, more directly." "Everyone has a list like that," she said. "Mine is longer than I'd like." "Ah, Hank," she looked at him. "You corrected the flue angle. You brought the brackets. You came in the storm and reinforced the entrance barrier. You built a room with an east-facing window." She paused. "A person is the accumulation of what they actually do, not the list of what they didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father said something like that, according to mine, that a man is measured by the weight of what he builds, not the weight of what he intended." "He was consistent, at least," Nora said. "In the good ways," Hank agreed. The spring light moved slowly across the hillside, perceptibly, at the pace of something real, not rushing. Years accumulated. That is the plain fact of it. And plain facts, as William Vance had believed, are gifts worth giving without decoration. Eli grew. He grew into his father's eyes and his grandfather's hands and his mother's precise, unhurried way of reading the world before acting on it. He became a builder in the fullest sense, not the limited professional sense, but the larger one, the sense that means a person understands the conversation between human intention and material reality and has devoted their life to conducting that conversation well. He traveled to other settlements, carrying the knowledge that had originated in this hillside, the thermal principles, the structural approaches, the fundamental understanding that the earth is not an obstacle, but a collaborator. And he taught what he knew with the patience of someone who has been well taught. He came home regularly, which he always would, because home is the place you have decided is the center of your own geography. And Eli had decided at 9 years old, in a cold excavation with his mother's hand on his back and a dog pressed against his side, and he had not reconsidered. One winter afternoon, years after the storm, Eli sat across from a young man at a settlement 2 valleys east, demonstrating the flue angle correction his mother had learned from his grandfather. "Steeper than you think," he said, adjusting the angle. "The smoke wants to travel horizontally. You have to convince it otherwise." The young man watched, nodded, tried it himself. "Where did you learn this?" the young man asked. "My mother learned it from her father," Eli said, "and she taught it to me. And now I'm teaching it to you." He looked at the young man steadily. "So, teach it to someone else." By the time Eli was grown, the heating principles that Nora had applied in the North Rise chamber had spread across a dozen settlements. People spoke of the Vance method without always knowing where it had originated. without knowing about a woman expelled in the cold, or a locked tin box, or a dog that had kept watch through a storm. The knowledge had outgrown the story, the way all truly useful things do eventually. But those who knew the story told it. Greta Anders told it to her children. The Reverend, in his later years, referenced it often in his sermons, not as a lesson about weather or survival, but as a lesson about what happens when a community refuses to hear what it does not want to know. Silas Webb's daughter, the child who had been carried to the chamber with blue lips and had asked whether the dog had a name, grew up and told it to her own children, beginning always the same way. There was a woman who knew things that no one would listen to, and she built something anyway, and it saved all of us. Petra Anders was a fixture of Eli's homecomings, had been, in fact, a fixture of most of the years between them, appearing at the chamber entrance with the regularity of someone who considers geography an insufficient reason for absence. She and Eli had the particular friendship of people who have survived something together in childhood and carry that survival as a permanent foundation beneath everything else they build. They argued about everything with the cheerful energy of people who trust each other completely, and therefore feel no need to be careful. Greta watched this from a comfortable distance and said nothing, which was perhaps the most sophisticated thing she had ever done. Soot died in the late autumn of a year when everything had gone well, the harvest abundant, the first cold arriving at the proper time, the world in one of its occasional moods of reasonable behavior. He died in his chosen place, near the fire in the original chamber, on the bedding that had been replaced and replaced again over the years, but had always been in the same location because he had decided that was where it belonged. He went gradually, the way old dogs go, less, then simply still, with the complete and peaceful stillness of something that has fulfilled its purpose and knows it. Eli dug the grave himself, near the entrance of the chamber, in the ground that had been the beginning of everything. He dug it carefully, at the proper depth, in the spot where the morning light reached first. He carved the stone himself also, with the tools he used for finish work, taking the care his mother had always taken with permanent things. He kept watch so we could rest. The family stood at the grave, Nora and Hank, Eli, Greta, and her husband and Petra, a collection of others who had accumulated around this place over the years, the way people accumulate around a source of warmth. And Petra cried without apology, openly, the way she had been doing most things since she was 7 years old, and had discovered that there was no particular advantage in concealment. No one suggested she shouldn't. The grandchild arrived in the life of the household the way new things arrive, when the ground is prepared for them, naturally, inevitably, as if they had always been coming and were simply now here. Her name was Clara, after Nora's mother, and she was 7 years old and possessed of the dark eyes and the considering expression of a child who has understood, earlier than most, that the world rewards careful attention. She had her father's directness and her mother's patience, and something that was entirely her own, a quality of stillness in the presence of things she found interesting, a willingness to wait for understanding rather than accepting the first available explanation. She found her grandmother in the original chamber on a morning in early autumn, when the light was doing what autumn light does, specific and golden, illuminating the particular rather than the general, each object given its own quality of presence. Nora was tending the fire. She did this every morning, as she had done every morning for more years than she kept precise count of, because some habits become not habits, but the physical expression of an understanding about what matters. Clara stood in the entrance to the chamber and looked at the walls, at the stonework, at the corrected flue and the organized shelving and the flat stone that had been Eli's desk when he was her age. She looked with the particular attention of a child assembling a question. "Did you really build all this yourself, Grandma?" Nora looked at her granddaughter, then at the chamber, then at the tin box still present against the wall, its lock replaced years ago with a simple clasp. Not because the secret needed keeping anymore, but because some things deserve to be housed with care regardless of their urgency. "Your great-grandfather started it," she said. "He understood this ground before I was born. He prepared it the way certain people prepare things, not knowing exactly who would need it or when, but understanding that the preparation itself was an act of love, and that love expressed through preparation outlasts almost everything else." She paused. I came here with your father's father and 3 matches and a sick child and a locked box I didn't yet know how to open. I finished what your great-grandfather began." Clara processed this with the methodical thoroughness of a child who prefers to understand completely before moving on. "And what did Daddy add?" 3 rooms on the north side, the water system, the garden wall, the second fire chamber. "And Grandpa Hank?" "The east window, the entrance door, the roof over the passage." Nora looked at her. "Every person who has lived here has added something. That is the nature of a place that is genuinely a home. It accumulates the people who have loved it." Clara looked around at the accumulation, at everything that had been added, layer by layer, the way the earth itself is built, slowly, by many hands, each addition resting on what came before. "What do I add?" she asked. It was the right question. It was, in fact, exactly the right question. The one that looked forward rather than backward. The one that understood that inheritance is not a destination, but a beginning. That what is handed down is not a completed thing and a direction. Nora smiled. It was the particular smile of a woman who has lived long enough to know that the best moments are not the dramatic ones, but the ones where something is genuinely passed on, not taken, not given under duress, but received by someone who already understands its value. "Sit down," she said. "I'll teach you what he taught me, and what I discovered after, and what your father learned that neither of us had thought to look for. And then," she looked at her granddaughter steadily, "you'll find the parts that belong to you. They're already there. Everything you need is already in you." She paused. "The ground taught me that, and the ground never lies." Clara sat down. They stayed there for a long time, the old woman and the child, in the chamber that had been built by multiple hands across multiple seasons of grief and work and love expressed through preparation. Nora talked and Clara listened and asked questions and listened again, and the fire held between them, steady, sufficient, exactly what it needed to be. At one point, Clara reached out and touched the tin box. The clasp, the scratched initials, the surface worn smooth in the places it had been handled most. "He left this here for you," she said, not a question. "He left it for whoever came," Nora said. "He didn't know it would be me, but it was." "Are you glad it was you?" Nora looked at the box, at the chamber around it, at the child sitting across from her with her father's directness and her grandmother's willingness to wait for the full answer. "I am glad," she said, "that I came back to the ground my father loved. I am glad that I finished what he began. I am glad that the ground held when everything else was taken." She looked at Clara directly. "And I am glad that you are sitting here, asking me questions that I can answer." Clara considered this with appropriate seriousness. Then she nodded once. Just once, the way her great-great-grandfather used to nod. The gesture that meant, "I don't fully understand yet, but I trust the direction." The continuity of it moved through Nora like the warmth from the fire. Not sharp, not sudden, just present and steady and real. Some things, passed hand to hand across enough years, become something larger than what they started as. A gesture, a phrase, a way of reading the ground, a knowledge that the earth holds more than cold, that it holds everything we love. If we understand it, if we respect it, if we build with it rather than against it. William Vance had known that. He had tried to leave it for whoever came. She had come. She had finished it. Now Clara sat beside the fire, leaning slightly forward in the way children lean when they are genuinely interested, and Nora began to teach. Outside, the autumn light continued its work. The entrance to the chamber framed a rectangle of it, gold and specific and entirely present, the way good things are present when they have been properly kept and properly handed on. The tin box sat against the wall, its clasp unfastened now, open to anyone who needed to look inside. The original deed inside it was yellowed and fragile at the edges, but the words remained clear. The surveyor's letter, folded the same way it had been folded when William Vance hid it from the world, had not changed. And the letter, the one that began with no name and ended with "I never stopped," had been read by several generations of hands now, each pair of hands bringing something different to it. Grief, relief, pride, the particular tenderness of understanding someone you never met. The ground was solid underfoot. It had always been solid. The storm had not changed that. The theft had not changed that. The expulsion and the mocking sign and the years of careful, deliberate dismissal had not changed that. The ground had been solid underneath all of it, waiting, holding, patient in the way that only very old things manage to be patient. Nora Vance had understood this from the beginning. She had learned it from a man who had understood it before her, and she had passed it on to a boy who had grown into a man who passed it on to others. And now a child named Clara sat beside the fire in the original chamber and was beginning to understand it for herself. And if you are facing your own storm right now, and perhaps you are, because most of us are somewhere in the long middle of one, always remember this: what you carry is not nothing. What you know is not nothing. The preparation that seems like stubbornness, and the knowledge that seems like eccentricity, and the refusal to stop that everyone around you has decided is either courage or foolishness, these are not nothing. They are everything. They are, in the end, what holds. What will you build when everything else is taken away? The answer is already in you. It has been there all along, waiting for the moment it becomes necessary. The ground never lies.